Principal funding for Rights and Wrongs has been provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Open Society Institute.
Hello, I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault, and you're watching Rights and Wrongs, the world's only television program devoted to covering global human rights issues. Our focus this week, human rights in the New World Order.
Cold War is over. We don't know really in which direction we are headed.
It's not the Red Army coming across the Bering Straits that you have to worry about anymore. It's the unemployed army of the South.
Global Vision presents Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television.
At the end of World War II, the triumphant Western powers began waging a new war, a Cold War, against a new enemy, global communism, led by the Soviet Union. A number of international organizations were set up to help guarantee global security and economic development. Among them were the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Today, with the Cold War over and the Soviet Union just a memory, these organizations are struggling to redefine and reinvent themselves as their leaders grapple with new emphasis and fresh approaches, and their critics call for reform and even abolition. Rights and Wrongs examines the human rights implications of this emerging New World Order.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, almost everything changed. The givens that we all operated with some confidence are no longer there. We always had a question we could ask ourselves and give ourselves an answer about how important the issue was. That's not there any longer.
5 decades ago, the answers seemed clearer. With much of Europe and Asia in ruins, global institutions intended to secure peace and prosperity were needed. Among them, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
By the end of the 1950s, the reconstruction of Europe and Asia was nearly complete. The Cold War battlefield shifted to the Third World.
Why did we care about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua? Not because of Nicaragua, but because if they succeeded in Nicaragua, how much did it change the balance between the Soviet Union and the United States?
But this balancing act between superpowers vanished along with the Soviet Union. So did all the easy answers.
I'm not saying that there are no answers, but I am saying we are in a time when we have to think a lot harder about what the answers should be than we had to before.
Times have changed so much, in fact, that some critics contend global institutions like the United Nations simply should be abolished. Author David Reef.
The UN as it exists, weak, corrupt, self-pitying, and largely supine, is exactly what the great powers want it to be. And so I don't think the chances of the kind of abolition that I would like to see are very high. But I think it would be better for the world, if we started again.
In his book, Slaughterhouse, Bosnia and the Failure of the West, Reef says the UN often does more harm than good.
The UN is not an effective organization. It has not made the lives of ordinary people better. It's simply a lie on the part of UN officials to claim that their activity over the last 50 years has improved the lives of most people.
Reef's views are not widely shared. Ian Williams is the author of The UN for Beginners.
The United Nations, for all its many faults, of which, and I've been very eager to point out many of its faults, it still has some potential, and it is the only forum where the developing world can be heard. Otherwise, they would be completely ignored, instead of just mostly ignored as they are at the moment.
But Williams believes that the World Bank and the IMF should be done away with.
Like Caesar's goal, it's divided into three parts. The IMF and the World Bank, I would say, are part of the problem. The UN is potentially part of the solution. The UN at least has one country, one vote, and can represent people's views. The IMF and World Bank are locked into the control of the people with the money, and they are the problem.
Many activists agree. For years, the World Bank and the IMF have been targeted by environmental and human rights groups.
I mean, right now, China, for example, a gross violator of human rights, gets more funds from the World Bank than any government or country in the world. Similarly, the IMF recently just gave another $10 billion to Russia to help underwrite Yeltsin's war against the people of Chechnya.
A bank spokesperson said that only economic considerations can be taken into account in their decision-making, and bank officials declined to appear on camera to discuss human rights. Instead, they provided a written explanation of how they say the World Bank contributes to the promotion and protection of human rights. One conclusion: in the final analysis, the purposes of the world community may be better served if political human rights are monitored by the relevant UN organizations.
The institutions, and I'll speak most specifically about the World Bank, have, I think it's fair to say, a phobia about human rights.
Patricia Armstrong monitors international financial institutions for the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights.
The bank still, with some limited exceptions, refuses to use the terminology, the human rights terminology.
Terminology is important to the World Bank, which has long sought to avoid association with human rights issues.
And I think we're playing word games here, frankly, when the bank claims that these are, quote, political issues that the bank simply is forbidden to deal with by its charter.
Its position is evolving, however, and bank officials now use words like governance and participation to describe development-related human rights concerns.
Both of these concepts, governance and participation, have human rights at their core. The freedom to associate, to assemble, to exchange information, to gather information.
Nevertheless, human rights activists still seem willing to give global economic and security institutions a chance to change, at least for now.
Well, there's no question institutions like the World Bank and the IMF are going through enormous growing pains given the dramatic changes that have taken place in the world. I think the glass is both half empty and half full. On the one hand, you have an institution that is beginning finally to hear voices from outside, including the voices of indigenous local human rights groups around the world. At the same time, you find great inertia and institutional resistance to any kind of change, which I think is inevitable. But it's equally inevitable that that change will have to come. Otherwise, these institutions won't have any role in the future.
You are watching Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television.
Coming up, we'll explore the future of the United Nations and other global security and development agencies with UN Assistant Secretary General Alvaro de Soto. But first, we'll examine one international institution, the World Bank, and one country where the New World Order is having a profound effect on the human rights of ordinary citizens. The country is Mexico, but it could be anywhere in the developing world. Our guide is economist Carlos Heredia, a former Mexican Finance Ministry official. Since leaving government service, Mr. Heredia has worked on human rights and development issues for a Mexican non-governmental organization known as Equipo Pueblo. Our story begins in Mexico City, where successive governments have followed a stringent economic program prescribed by the World Bank.
In 1982, the government of Mexico adopted a new economic model designed to attract foreign investment by raising interest rates, suppressing wages, promoting exports and liberalizing trade. It also began deregulating and privatizing virtually the entire Mexican economy. What impact do these economic policy decisions have on the lives of ordinary Mexicans? Economist Rocio Mejia works for one of Mexico's largest banking groups.
While Mexico became the model that the World Bank promoted throughout the hemisphere, the result was very negative. The adjustment program caused poverty to increase, destroyed local producers, and made Mexico dangerously dependent on foreign capital.
The effects of the World Bank's economic programs are most noticeable in places like San Miguel Teotongo, a poor neighborhood on the outskirts of Mexico City. The cost of living here keeps going up, but wages do not. When President Salinas was in power, he said that Mexico was headed straight to the developed world. He came to power in 1988. Have things gotten better or worse for you since then?
Much worse. Much worse.
One measure of how things have gotten worse is in housing. Rising unemployment and falling incomes have led to severe overcrowding. How many apartments are in this building?
There are 13 homes.
Does your husband have a job?
Yes.
What does he do?
He's a door-to-door salesman.
Can you live off his salary?
No, not really. Sometimes we can pay the rent. Sometimes it doesn't get paid.
How many people live in this room?
4.
But you only have one bed. Does that mean...
Yes, 4 of us sleep in that bed.
Here in San Miguel, water is scarce and rationed. One result of World Bank policies has been a lack of resources to develop and maintain public services. Residents here only have running water 1 day every 3 weeks. And it takes more than a day's wages to buy a pound of meat. The new economic policies are forcing small producers off the land and into increasingly crowded urban slums. Emilio Garcia heads an organization of small farmers.
In Mexico, there are 30 or 40 million people who live in the countryside, who live off the land. For us, this is a major cultural issue, and no politician educated at Harvard or some other university in the United States can come and tell us we have to reduce the rural population to some small percentage.
World Bank policies called for the removal of export and import trade barriers. As a result, the Mexican economy was open to large corporations from the north, and Mexican industry now operates at less than 1/3 of its capacity. Mr. Artiz owns a mid-sized machine shop in Mexico City. Like many Mexican employers, he has become disillusioned with World Bank policies. They said a free trade export model would stimulate the economy, that businesses making products for export would draw along the medium and small businesses that sell to them.
This is a bold-faced lie. It is the government talking about the engine of the economy and the engine of scale. These are great technocratic phrases that have nothing to do with reality.
Ultimately, in December of '94, the Mexican peso and economy collapsed. The response of the U.S. Treasury was to bail out Mexico's creditors on Wall Street and impose on Mexico an even more draconian adjustment program. Since then, close to half of Mexico's enterprises have gone out of business, and another 2 million Mexicans have lost their jobs. While 2/3 of the population now earn incomes below the poverty line. So more and more people have entered the drug trade, and immigration to the United States has surged.
Every day, there are demonstrations against the new economic policies throughout Mexico. Middle-class Mexicans are protesting runaway interest rates charged by the newly privatized and deregulated banks.
I borrowed about $14,000 to buy a microbus, but now I have to pay back $28,000. I'm not saying I won't pay, I want to pay, but I want to pay something that's fair, something that's right, nothing more.
Representative Maria del Rosario Robles heads the Social Development Committee of the Mexican Congress.
Well, I don't think the World Bank understands the changes that have taken place in Mexico. It's not dealing with the reality that we face. Every day, the number of people joining the ranks of the poor, the new poor, is increasing. With almost 2/3 of the population living below the poverty line, we have to rethink the whole situation and devise new social policies that truly attempt to combat poverty.
But to talk to the people who create Mexico's economic policies, I had to leave Mexico City and travel north to Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, Development Gap.
My first stop was at a non-governmental organization that has long been critical of World Bank policies. Doug Hellinger heads the Development Gap.
I think we make a tremendous error when we mistake these policies of structural adjustment for development policies. They're not development policies. They're really designed to serve the interest not of the Mexican people, but of foreign investors, particularly those on Wall Street. They are designed to push up short-term interest rates to attract foreign capital. Yet those same high interest rates destroy small businesses, small farms, and with them millions of jobs. Investors may come to a certain extent, but wages are pushed down, demand is diminished in these countries, and you have the rebound effect of pushing down wages in the United States as corporations can hold it over workers' heads in the United States so they can go to Mexico.
Hellinger suggested that I go to the U.S. Treasury Department to talk to Lawrence Summers, the former chief economist of the World Bank. Today, he's Deputy Secretary of the Treasury.
Dr. Summers, how are you? Nice to meet you. I'm Carlos Heredia from Mexico. Right now, in 1996, most Mexicans are worse off than they were at the beginning of the 1980s when the structural adjustment policies started being implemented in my country.
Well, I think the assessment is very, very complicated, and there are a variety of problems. I don't think it's right to say that the average Mexican is worse off than
I'm using official
at the beginning
statistics.
of the. Well, there are different ways to use official statistics, and there are
I'm using per capita
different
income.
indicators of consumption. If you look at life expectancy, if you look at the number of kids who are educated, if you look at the size of average food units, if you look at the average housing units, if you look at the amount of food people are able to eat, I don't think the picture is quite as bleak as you suggest. I believe that the vast majority of Mexicans recognize that an important part of the greater integration into the world economy that is essential if Mexico is to prosper is for Mexico to meet its financial obligations. And I have no doubt that with sound economic policies, Mexico has the prospect of meeting its obligations and enjoying a return to rates of economic growth significantly higher than it has seen in many years. And I think its citizens deserve no less.
Finally, I arrived at the World Bank itself. I spoke with Shahid Javed Burki, Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean.
In the early 1990s, Mexico was supposed to graduate from the World Bank, yet it's fallen into a very deep economic crisis. What went wrong?
Number one, I wouldn't say that anything serious went wrong. The recipe is correct now. What's called the liberal solution to economic management, the so-called Washington consensus. The only thing that needs to be added to that is to worry about the impact of these kinds of adjustments on the more vulnerable segments of the population.
How are you accountable to the people who are the alleged beneficiaries of your projects?
I'm accountable to the Board of Governors, which includes Mexico as a member.
But you're not accountable to the people who are allegedly the beneficiaries of your programs in support of education, food, etc.?
I'm accountable to the government, and I hope the governments are accountable to the people.
What happens if they're not?
That's not for me to decide. We work with the governments. I think that's would do. Thank you.
Rights and Wrongs is now online. Please be in touch with us by email and visit our internet site on the World Wide Web.
We are joined by Alvaro de Soto, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Political Affairs. Mr. de Soto, welcome. Lawrence Eagleburger, former Secretary of State, observed that everything changed at the end of the Cold War. In terms of human rights, I mean, how did the UN's approach to human rights change?
It has changed a lot. What you find is that with the end of the Cold War, the United Nations was able to do things that were totally unprecedented, which, for instance, included nationwide, long-term monitoring of human rights in particular cases, which is something that we did starting in 1991 in El Salvador. We're doing it now in Guatemala, doing it in Haiti, and also in Rwanda. This is not something that you can do in every case, but that has made a fundamental difference to the situation of human rights in all those cases.
What about some of the critics who say that the UN hasn't performed very well in the post-Cold War world, that some of the responsibilities for dealing with human rights that fall, say, in peacekeeping or refugee situations have just not been handled very well?
I think the world got caught off guard. With the end of the Cold War, there appeared a whole host of new problems that we were not accustomed to dealing with. A lot of parts of the world and a lot of subject matters were essentially off limits to the United Nations until the late 80s and the early 90s. And then there was a high expectation that the UN could do everything and solve virtually everything. And it turned out that these new problems were very, very difficult to handle, including internal conflict, ethnic conflict, the breakdown of state institutions, particularly in areas for which the major powers used to compete back during the Cold War.
What about those who say that, okay, member states need to make up their minds, but the UN also needs internal reform? That criticism's been going on a long time. Do you see reforms that need to be taken and that may be being undertaken that will answer some of those criticisms, that will bring the UN truly into the new world order?
Obviously, there is need to adapt to the new situation that we have out there, but the need is for strengthening rather than weakening it. And to follow the adage of the architects, form follows function. Let's first decide what we want to use this tool for, and then let's design it accordingly.
Let me ask you about international monetary institutions, because when they do an analysis of problems, their considerations are primarily economic, but there are those who say that these institutions also should take into account the human rights implications. What do you say to that, and is there a way to achieve a balance?
In fact, the World Bank today has a very strong social agenda, and they are getting more involved in the area of governance, good governance, supporting institution building by governments in order to give them the capability to run their governments much better. The International Monetary Fund is more, let's say, orthodox. It's more careful in the way it handles its problem, and they don't have that type of an agenda because they're more in the financial and monetary area.
So if you had to characterize where all of these institutions are now in terms of adjusting and adapting to the new, emerging new world situation, how would you characterize that adjustment?
Well, I think the idea is really that we should be working toward an integrated approach to the problems of human security and try to approach them together jointly. And this is one of the high priority items, even though it does sound rather lofty and all-encompassing, but it is one of the high priorities in this era of transition through which we are going now. Cold War is over. We don't know really in which direction we are headed. We don't know what's going to follow the Cold War. All we know is that this is a transition that is probably as important as the end of World War II, World War I, even the Napoleonic Wars.
So is it difficult, or should I say, how difficult is it?
It's a minefield out there. It's very, very difficult, and there are new problems that no one ever dreamed of when the UN Charter was drawn up in the early 40s.
Well, Mr. De Soto, thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please write us or reach us via email. I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault. Thank you for watching Rights and Wrongs.
Principal funding for Rights and Wrongs has been provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Open Society Institute. Rights and Wrongs welcomes your written comments and suggestions. You can also order a transcript for $5 or a video cassette for $29.95 plus $5 shipping and handling by writing to The Global Center, Box 311, Radio City Station, New York 10101. Checks or money orders only. Credit card holders may call 1-800-541-2535. You can also reach us by email. And please visit our website on the World Wide Web.
Hello, I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault. 35,000 people converged in Beijing, China last summer to shape an agenda for women's rights. Join me this week on Rights and Wrongs as we look beyond Beijing and assess the progress of women's rights as human rights. That's Rights and Wrongs, television's only news magazine of human rights. Hello, I'm Charlene Hunter-Gault. 35,000 people converged in Beijing, China last summer to shape an agenda for women's rights. Join me this week on Rights and Wrongs as we look beyond Beijing and assess the progress of women's rights as human rights. That's Rights and Wrongs, television's only news magazine of human rights.